Today, we're going to look at the Jewish Annotated Study Bible. But before we do that, thank you so much to everybody who has continued to spread word about this channel, who's liked, who's commented, who's shared our videos. You guys are letting YouTube know that you appreciate this content, and I, in turn, really appreciate that. Our goal this year is 20,000 subscribers by the end of the year. I don't know if we're going to make it. That's a crazy goal, but if people keep responding the way you've been responding so far, then I'm sure we will. And that'll be super helpful in continuing to fund the ministry of Disciple Dojo. Not just our Bible teaching videos, but our Refugee Jitsu outreach and our grown-ups table ministry for single adults. So all of this we are only able to do because of those of you who support this channel, as well as those of you who give financially to Disciple Dojo. If you appreciate what we do here and you'd like to become a dojo donor at any dollar amount per month, we would love to invite you to do so. If you want to help us out, that's one of the best tangible ways that you can do that, as we are entirely nonprofit and donor funded. Okay, let's take a look at a unique study Bible. So this is the Jewish Annotated New Testament. Now, this is not a Christian publication. This was done entirely by Jewish scholars, none of whom identify as Messianic Jewish or followers of Jesus. So this is not a Christian product. Just like the Jewish Study Bible that we looked at by Oxford and the Jewish Annotated Apocrypha, the Jewish Annotated New Testament completes the set. This is the first edition. These two are both second edition. That's why they don't really match. And these all together are basically Jewish versions of the Oxford Annotated Study Bible, which was done by Christian scholars. We've reviewed this here on the channel. We've also reviewed all of these on the channel. So you can take a look at those. I'll link them in the video description. And just as the new Oxford Annotated Study Bible contains contributions by Christian scholars from a wide range among mainline Christianity, more or less, though there are a few evangelical contributors, the Jewish Annotated set also contains the perspective of Jewish scholars from across the spectrum of modern Judaism. So you'd have some Orthodox, some conservative, some Reformed. So these are all kind of in the same family of resources. But this is the only one that we have not done a Disciple Dojo review of yet. So what are you going to find if you pick this up? Well, it's available in hardback, like I have. It is 824 pages. There's no color anywhere in it. There are no color maps at the back, which you see in a lot of larger study Bibles. There are a few black and white maps sprinkled throughout, not very many, just a few here and there. The text is 2-column. It's not a red letter edition. The annotations at the bottom of each page are in 1 column, and it is in the New Revised Standard Version. Now, there are a number of in-text essays. They're sort of shaded in a light gray, and they have to do with various topics. Here's one on the concept of rabbi. Here's one on circumcision and the phrase works of the law that Paul uses in his letters. And they give you background information from the world of Judaism that help you make sense of the New Testament and what the New Testament authors were saying, because almost all of the New Testament authors were first century Jews, with one, maybe two exceptions. You're also going to get introductions at the beginning of each section of the New Testament, of which there's only 2. So you're going to get an introduction by Amy Jill Levine and Mark Brettler, who are the primary editors of this volume, on the Gospels and Acts. And then you're going to get another introduction when you get to the section, the Epistles and Revelation. In addition, each book gets about a 2 or 3 page introduction, and each book introduction is slightly different. Some book introductions will spend a lot of time talking about issues of date and setting or authorship theories. Some will spend more time talking about key themes that you're going to find throughout the book or how the book sits within the New Testament. And then some are going to spend a lot of time talking about particular issues that are important that have to do with Judaism or ancient Jewish background that Christian readers in particular may not be familiar with. And that lack of familiarity goes the other way as well. Modern Jewish readers who are familiar with Jewish background and ancient Jewish culture often aren't familiar with the New Testament itself because they see it as a Christian or a Gentile document. So right at the beginning, in the editor's preface, they let us know what the purpose of this study Bible is. It says, it is almost 2 millennia since the earliest texts incorporated into the New Testament were composed. For the most part, these centuries have seen a painful relationship between Jews and Christians. Although Jewish perceptions of Christians and Christian perceptions of Jews have improved markedly in recent decades, Jews and Christians still misunderstand many of each other's texts and traditions. The landmark publication of this book is a witness to the improvement. Ideally, it will serve to increase our knowledge of both our common histories and the reasons why we came to separate. And then at the end of the preface, they conclude by saying, we hope that non-Jewish readers will learn to appreciate that significant sections of the New Testament derive from the heart of Judaism. And they will be able to understand these texts without importing false notions of the tradition of Jesus and his earliest followers. We further hope that this volume will make the New Testament more welcoming to Jewish readers, many of whom are unfamiliar with its contents, that these new readers may become better acquainted with the traditions of their neighbors, and that perhaps they may even experience holy envy in the reading. And holy envy is a quote by Krister Stendhal, used to express the idea that a religious tradition different from the one we practice may express beautiful and meaningful notions. Now, this was well received when it was published, which is why there's a second edition. And the main difference between the first edition and the second edition is that the first edition at the back contained about 30 essays covering a variety of topics having to do with the Jewish world of the New Testament. The second edition, they have almost doubled that number. Like a third of this book are concluding essays, 54 of them, as well as an extensive glossary and timelines and indexes. Now, this has taken me longer to review this than any other study Bible we've looked at here at Disciple Dojo because there are hundreds of pages of essays at the back. And that's in addition to all of the in-text mini essays, as well as the book introductions. And that's in addition to the annotations at the bottom of each page of the text. So if this were just the New Testament alone, it might be like maybe this much of the book. So that's how much material, study material you're getting in the Jewish Annotated New Testament. Now, I would probably recommend, if you were going to use this, that you read the essays first. That's where I would say to start, because not only do they give an overview of the history of Judaism between the time of the Old Testament and when the New Testament text was written, but they also give you background into Jewish approaches to the New Testament. They talk about issues like the history of Christian anti-Semitism, as well as the history of Jewish anti-Jesusness. In other words, it's not just like there's only been a one-way flow of hatred. In fact, in the New Testament itself, one of the biggest sources of conflict is the rejection that non-believing Jews, and when I say non-believing, I mean non-believing in Jesus, exhibited towards the followers of Jesus. And so the New Testament, we have basically this split between different visions of Judaism. And only as the New Testament moves along do you start seeing Gentiles coming in larger numbers. And then in following centuries, the church basically became almost entirely Gentile and went through a process of like de-Judaization. And the rift between followers of Jesus and post-Second Temple Jewish traditions only widened. So the essays in the back are meant to kind of bridge that divide a little bit. Now, there are always going to be foundational theological differences between followers of Jesus and followers of Torah who do not follow Jesus. That there's never going to be a universal religion that we all agree on. And that's okay. What the contributors to the Jewish Annotated New Testament are trying to do is highlight those areas that are impassable. In other words, the areas where Christians and Jews will always disagree. They want to make sure that those are clearly presented and that they're fairly represented. And at the same time, the misconceptions that Christians have about Jews and that Jews have about Christians, they want to do their best to dispel those. And that's what you find at the back in these essays. So, for instance, there's some essays that have to do with Paul and gender, or Paul and Judaism, because among many Jewish thinkers through the centuries, Paul is not a favorable character. Paul has been portrayed as self-hating. He's been portrayed as the real founder of Christianity. And the essays in the back talk about how over the centuries, there have been attempts by Jews to kind of reclaim, and reclaim is not even the right word because Jesus never left, but in the minds of some Gentile Christians and even some Jewish observers, Jesus became this emblem of Gentile faith, especially with the rise of Christian nationalism in Europe and what led to the horrors of Nazism and the Holocaust. But even despite that, there have always been Jewish thinkers who in some way wanted to count Jesus as one of their own. Even if he was seen as a wayward Jew, he was still seen as a Jew. Paul, on the other hand, has had a much colder reception among most Jewish communities. But given how much of the New Testament claims to be written by Paul, the contributors to the Jewish Annotated New Testament wanted to read Paul on his own terms, in his own setting, in his own context, as a Pharisee, student of Gamaliel, steeped in Second Temple Judaism. And when you do that, lo and behold, Paul is well within Second Temple Judaism. And a lot of the notes and essays that have to do with Paul in the Jewish Annotated New Testament are aimed at reclaiming Paul's Jewishness as well. Another essay that I thought was especially interesting is the essay on page 688, talking about how John in chapter 1 of John's Gospel in the prologue is really giving what should be read as a first century Jewish midrash on Genesis. That rather than John and the other gospel authors just importing wholesale all of these Greek, pagan, Gentile notions of God, yes, they're writing in Greek, just like the Septuagint translators and the intertestamental literature writers wrote in Greek, because Greek was the lingua franca of the day. It was the language that everybody knew. But what they were writing is far more at home in the world of Judaism than it is in later Greco-Roman thought. And so the essay did a great job of rooting John's use of the concept of logos within the thought world of Second Temple Judaism. There was also an essay on Messianic Judaism. Now, Messianic Judaism has had a mixed reception both among Jews and Christians. With Messianic Judaism, and it's a fairly new movement tracing back, in terms of as a worldwide movement to the 20th century, although Messianic Jewish adherents would say, no, we actually go all the way back to Pentecost. And there's an argument to be made for that for sure. But in terms of how it's perceived from the outside world, Messianic Judaism has had a rocky history because some Christians have looked at it and said, why don't you just become Christians? Like, why don't you just join us in Christian churches? Why are you still keeping your Jewish culture and some of your Jewish prayers and some of your Jewish religious ideas? You guys follow Jesus. Just come be Christians. And Jews have looked at this and said, you're just pretending that you're Jewish. You're actually Christian. You're trying to deceive people. You're trying to make people think that you're Jewish, but you follow Jesus, and no Jew can follow Jesus. So you are like undercover Christians trying to lure people away from Judaism. Now, not every Messianic congregation or not every Messianic believer has faced this, but many, if not most, have. Because Messianic Judaism is something of a hybrid in that it takes its cultural identity and its worship practices from the synagogue, but its theology and its acceptance of the New Testament and the gospel from Christianity. And so often Messianic Jewish worshipers don't completely feel at home in either context. So the essay at the back on this tries to give, I think, overall a very fair history of Messianic Judaism and how it arose and what its proponents are seeking to do and what the criticisms against it are. And that's what overall you find in the Jewish Annotated New Testament. You find a very, I don't want to say objective because it's impossible for anybody to be truly objective, but you find a strong effort to be objective among the contributors. In other words, none of the contributors accept the New Testament as their scripture. None of the contributors would say the New Testament is part of the inspired canon of Scripture, along with the Torah, the writings, and the prophets. But despite that, they do a very good job of looking at the New Testament and evaluating it fairly. That's what impressed me the most about the Jewish Annotated New Testament. I felt like it was being fair. I felt like this was being more fair than some mainline Protestant interpretations of the Bible. Now, there are some things in here. If you're a more evangelical, a more conservative, more Orthodox Christian, there are some things that you're going to read that you're just not going to agree with. They typically tend to late date the books of the New Testament. So, for example, the contributors do not accept that Jesus was a legitimate prophet. Well, passages in the Gospels where Jesus prophesies about the destruction of Jerusalem, those are seen as having to have been written after the fact, because predictive prophecy, obviously that can't happen. So on page 9, at the beginning of Matthew, it'll say in date and setting, the Gospel of Matthew suggests that the Jerusalem temple has been destroyed and thus must date after 70 CE. The CE is just a secular way of saying AD. It just means common era. Do you see what they're saying? They're saying, look, in Matthew's gospel, Jesus speaks about the temple's destruction. So that means that it must have already taken place. And therefore, the earliest Matthew could be written is 70 AD after the temple's destroyed. Well, that's based entirely on the assumption that predictive prophecy can't happen, that it doesn't exist. So that's going to be a difference if you're someone who believes that actually no, prophecy can happen. Jesus could accurately predict the destruction of the temple. These things don't require late dating of a text just because the text talks about it. And in fact, you could make a pretty good argument that actually all of the Gospels are most likely written before the temple's destruction because the descriptions of how it was going to happen, they could have been a little clearer if you were writing them after the event. And we know that Acts is the sequel to Luke's gospel, and Acts ends with Paul still alive in Rome, and that happened before the destruction of the temple, late 60s. The temple was destroyed in 70. So it seems much more likely that Acts was written before Paul had died, because Paul's like the star of the book, and something about his death might have been mentioned if it had happened, especially with how much prominence the death of other saints are given in extra-biblical literature. So it would be really weird if Luke didn't write about Paul's martyrdom in Rome, which happened in the late 60s. And therefore, Acts was written after Luke, so Luke has to predate 70 AD. And Luke used other written sources about Jesus, which he says in his opening introduction to the gospel. So there were likely other written accounts about Jesus' life circulating before that time as well. And so all of the gospels could easily fit in the time period before 70 AD. And in fact, you could make a stronger argument that they all date to before 70 AD. This isn't a video about the dating of the Gospels. What I'm trying to do is just show you ways in which the theological presuppositions of the contributors are going to color how they approach the text. And one of those ways is Jesus is not an inspired prophet of God. Therefore, such predictions must indicate a later date for the writing of that text. Very similar to mainline liberal theologians in Christian traditions. You also see this when you come to Paul. There are 13 letters that claim to be written by Paul, but a number of them, modern mainline liberal Protestant scholars say, no, Paul didn't write them. And the Jewish Annotated New Testament kind of follows suit in that. So in the introduction to, let's say, the pastoral epistles, you're going to read, well, these claim to be written by Paul, but they probably aren't. I'll give you an example. In the introduction to 1 Timothy, it says, it is likely that the pastorals, that's 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, represent the views of late 1st or early 2nd century followers of Jesus who appealed to Paul for their authority and perhaps sought to reclaim Paul from other factions that promoted celibacy, personal authority over ecclesial order, and women's authoritative roles, all issues that this epistle disputes. So the approach they're taking when they come to the disputed Pauline texts is basically, okay, in some of these letters that Paul writes, there are things that don't seem to fit with what he said elsewhere. So for instance, in 1 Timothy, that's where you find his not permitting a woman to teach or having authority over a man. And since Paul, in his known writings, did not seem to take that attitude. They say, so this means that somebody else probably wrote this, or at least it's one piece of evidence that somebody else probably wrote this. So these criteria like style, shared vocabulary, or theological tension are used as evidence to say, well, this is probably not actually written by Paul. Now, you can make arguments for pseudepigraphic writings, as our friend David Da Silva talked about in our recent discussion. There are arguments to be made that some letters in the New Testament seem to be pseudepigraphical. 2 Peter is a great example of one that even some evangelical scholars say this is actually probably something closer to maybe like a last will and testament compiled after Peter, but using traditions that he passed on or whatever. Those are slightly different arguments, but when it comes to the epistles and which ones were by Paul and which ones weren't by Paul, the criteria for evaluating that aren't always as certain as some interpreters would lead you to believe. And if you, again, don't think that the New Testament is inspired literature, if you don't think that it is trustworthy inherently, and that it is part of Scripture, and therefore what it teaches is actually true, if that's not your presupposition, which it's not for any of the contributors of this volume, then those questions are going to be much easier to entertain the idea of, well, no, this part's wrong, this part is a later addition, this contradicts with this. You know, you're going to pick it apart a little more cavalierly than you will if these are your theological texts. So it doesn't surprise me that the contributors take this route. It doesn't offend me that they take these views. And it's certainly not a reason to condemn the Jewish annotated New Testament, because it doesn't claim to be under any Christian ecclesial authority. It is very much an outsider's perspective of the New Testament. And even though there's some differences on those type of foundational issues, overall, it's a very fair and a very well done outsider's perspective. Now, if you've watched any of our reviews here, you know that we usually look at 2 books in the Old Testament and how the study notes and the interpreters present those, Genesis and Exodus. Obviously, we can't do that for this because it's only the New Testament, but I do want to point out a few things about the 2 books of the New Testament that we usually comment on in these reviews, so you'll understand what you're getting when you get to the text itself. When you come to Romans, it does a pretty good job overall of walking you through the letter. It roots Paul in his first century Jewishness. It doesn't present this kind of Gentile picture of Paul that some Jewish readers have mistakenly assumed to be the case. And it even, when you get to Romans chapter 7, who is this I figure, the I who can't do what I want. I know what I want to do. I desire the good, but sin is right there. What a wretched man I am. Who is the I of Romans chapter 7? Well, there's a whole essay about the I of Romans chapter 7. You don't even get this in a lot of Christian study Bibles when you come to the book of Romans. So seeing it in a Jewish annotated New Testament, that was wonderful. And there's also a good discussion about the sin nature and the rabbinic concept of the Yetzer HaTov, the good inclination, versus the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. And this is a concept that wasn't foreign to Judaism by any means. This inner struggle that Paul is talking about. It's not like you can only experience that if you're a born-again Christian. So the notes in Romans, particularly like chapters 6 through 8, I thought were very good. Now, when we come to Romans 9 through 11, it's a little trickier because Romans 9 through 11 is all about Paul wrestling with the very notion that his fellow Jews, for the most part, have not accepted the gospel. And even among Christians, there's difference of interpretation of what's going on in Romans 9 through 11, particularly in Romans 11, where Paul talks about all Israel will be saved. And there's this analogy of an olive tree and natural branches that have been broken off and unnatural wild branches that have been grafted in. And even among Christians, there's disagreement on that. Well, the notes in the Jewish annotated New Testament would lean to what I would call a far dispensationalist reading. Just to summarize it quickly, the notes say that the phrase broken off branches is not how it should be translated. It probably should be translated as bent branches. So in other words, God hasn't broken off Israelites who don't believe in Jesus. They've been bent And then another translation suggestion that they make is when it talks about a partial hardening of Israel has occurred, those who don't accept Jesus, that hardening, which we think of as like Pharaoh hardening his heart, or, being hardened to the things of God, having a hard heart. The interpretation here says that is actually, no, it should be calloused. It's talking about a callus, and a callus in particular to seal and to protect it. So the branches in Paul's analogy in Romans 11, unbelieving Jews who don't accept the gospel, they aren't broken off, they are bent, and they are being protected until sometime when all Israel is saved. Now, this is very much the lines that people who hold to something like a dual covenant approach would take, that, Jesus was for the Gentiles and Torah is how Israel is saved, and they're both saved together, two covenants, but it's all God's people. You hear this among some popular dispensationalist teachers, and that's similar to the approach that's being taken, at least from what I can tell in reading these notes. And that is very different than most Christian interpretations. Most Christian interpretations would say, no, actually, if that were the case, Paul wouldn't be anguished over the current plight of his fellow Jews who are rejecting the gospel. But he opens the whole section with a discussion of how much anguish he feels, and that he wishes he could cut himself off for the sake of his kinsmen according to the flesh who do not accept Jesus as Israel's Messiah, which is what Paul's entire goal is for Jew and Gentile together. So to take the approach that they take in Romans, I see why the interpreters take the approach, and I sympathize with it. This whole project is to reconcile Jews and Gentiles. And so Romans 9, 10, and particularly Romans 11 is one of those foundationally divisive passages if you read it in the traditional way that most interpreters have read it. So it makes sense why they would opt for reading it in a different way, because it lessens the tension between the synagogue and the church if you don't have to think of either as broken off branches or wild branches grafted in, and you can it's a nicer way to read Romans in some regards. The question is it what Paul was actually saying? And then when we come to Revelation, we usually look at that in these study Bible reviews. There's a good introduction to Revelation. The study notes, the annotations throughout, they're pretty good. The essays are very good. The little mini gray blocks of essay material, these are great throughout Revelation. They highlight Revelation as a Jewish apocalypse, which is what it was, and there is a long history of Jewish apocalyptic writings. They talk about the numerology that Revelation uses. They even take on some of the difficult language that Revelation presents in terms of Christian-Jewish relations. The famous passages about the synagogue of Satan. What is the synagogue of Satan referring to? And that's another issue, just like Romans chapter 11, where there are going to be some pretty divisive interpretations. One interpretation of the synagogue of Satan is that is an ironic way that Jesus, Israel's Messiah, is referring to those who claim to be followers of the God of Israel, but who reject his Messiah and who contribute to the persecution of the followers of his Messiah by kicking them out of the synagogue, by saying, if you follow this Jesus character, if you worship this Jesus, you're no longer welcome in the synagogue. You are no longer Jewish. Well, if you get kicked out of the synagogue in first century Rome and you refuse to worship Caesar, you're no longer under the protection that Rome had given the Jewish faith. So you could be Jewish and not worship Caesar and be fine. But if a Jewish group told the authorities, no, they're actually not part of us, you weren't protected, and you would face the possibility of persecution, or at least animosity because of your faith. So one interpretation of that synagogue of Satan has always been it's an ironic, apocalyptic way of pointing out that no, it's not the people who trace their ancestral lineage through the synagogue that are the true Jews, that are the true synagogue. Rather, it's the followers of the Lamb of God. Those are the people who are truly the Israel of God, Jew and Gentile together. That's the traditional, more orthodox Christian interpretation. The interpretation you're going to find in the Jewish Annotated New Testament, they say John means synagogue of Satan only as a rejection of those pretending to be Jews. The real Jews are the one who, like John, follow a strict priestly interpretation of halakha in the areas of dietary law and sexual impurity, taken in the context of John's sustained embrace of priestly identity. So what they're suggesting is John is talking about the synagogue of Satan, referring to actually not Jews at all, but referring to Gentiles who claim to be Jews through virtue of their following the Jewish Messiah, but they do all the things that Judaism forbids. Sexual immorality, the food laws, all of that stuff. And that's an interesting interpretation, and it would take more than a video of this length to really unpack it and to weigh out the pros and the cons. Ultimately, it's an interpretation I think is interesting, but I don't think it's compelling for a number of reasons. If you're interested in some of those reasons, I would encourage you to check out our free course here at Disciple Dojo, Revelation, a guided tour of the apocalypse. We walk through the book of Revelation chapter by chapter, looking at its specifically Jewish background, as well as how it incorporates other Greco-Roman concepts. So if you're interested, check that out. And of course, we always look at how do study Bibles handle the background of the Church of Laodicea, because that's one of the textbook examples of where knowing the background of a city in Revelation helps to understand what Jesus is telling the church in that city. Sadly, the notes on Laodicea, almost none. It mentions that there was an earthquake there, which is true, but it doesn't go into anything about the hot, cold, the eye salve, the gold, all of these things. And we've talked about these in other reviews. So if you're wondering what I'm talking about, just watch any of our other study Bible reviews. We probably mention it there. But the notes do a great job of pointing out all of the imagery in Revelation that has to do with the temple and how it draws from the prophetic Old Testament texts. There's a good discussion of 666 and how that is contrasted with the seal of the Lamb. So overall, the notes throughout, the annotations that are presented on the bottom of each page, they do a great job of situating these New Testament passages in their Jewish setting. They reflect a good bit of what you find, particularly in mainline New Testament scholarship, but also in a lot of evangelical New Testament scholarship. They're just a little sparse. You're not going to get, they're not full-blown study notes. They're annotations, just like in the Oxford Annotated. Even the way they're laid out on the page, they're just laid out in block text format, kind of like how footnotes are usually laid out in more academic writing. So you're not getting devotional study notes. I mean, that's not the point of this project. So would I recommend the Jewish Annotated New Testament? I absolutely recommend this. In fact, I think every Christian should have a copy of this handy. I do not think this would be anyone's primary study Bible. I don't think the contributors would intend for it to be anybody's primary study Bible. It is a Jewish reflection on the New Testament with the hopes of bridging the divide between church and synagogue. And that's something that we should all be on board with. They go out of their way to not take pot shots at Christianity, to not caricature Christianity. They note some of the Jewish misconceptions about Christians and how some of the thinkers in Jewish history have distorted different aspects of Christianity. They are candid about the polemical nature that's existed between church and synagogue. They take the church to task for its role in fostering or at least allowing anti-Semitism to flourish. These are all good things. So for that reason, yes, I definitely recommend, if you're an educated Christian wanting to better understand not just the New Testament, but your Jewish friends and neighbors, which you should be, this is a great resource to have. I could see if you had a friend who was Jewish and you were a Christian, sitting down with this together and reading through it, or maybe this, and then if you're an evangelical Christian, maybe one of the better evangelical study Bibles out there, sitting and reading together and comparing the way that, say, the Biblical Theology Study Bible or the Life Application Study Bible handles a passage and how the Jewish Annotated New Testament handles it. That would be a great exercise in interreligious dialogue. You'd both learn a lot. So this is part of the set that I would recommend if you are a Christian in particular, and you are wanting to better understand your Jewish neighbors, if you are wanting to develop a fuller approach to the New Testament, see things that you may have missed because of lack of familiarity with the Jewish background, I would recommend these volumes, absolutely. If for no other reason than the essays in the back of each one. That's where all three of these volumes shine. It's a great way to get exposed to the different traditions that make up Judaism, which is just as varied as Christianity. Judaism's not monolithic, neither is Christianity. So those are my thoughts on the Jewish Annotated New Testament. I would love to hear yours. Share them in the comments section below. Be sure to check out some of our other videos where we take a look at Jewish resources that help Christians better understand Judaism, the Bible, the world that Jesus lived in. And stay tuned for more reviews here on Disciple Dojo. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.